Last year, I asked for people in the church to submit some ideas or themes or books of the Bible that you would like for me to preach from. And the book of Daniel was one of the suggestions, as was the book of Job, and a reference in the book of Revelation. And so I took these suggestions along with the liturgical season and my own thoughts and spent time in prayer and discernment before setting out the worship calendar for this year. And so we'll spend some time in Daniel between now and Lent. We can't possibly touch on all 12 chapters, but like other books of the Bible, there is a treasure trove within the pages of Daniel that can speak to us today. And through these ancient stories, God has a way of making these words become a living word among us, a much needed word for us. And so it is my hope that we can find inspiration to be courageous, to never lose hope, to be bold in our faith, to push back from who or what seeks to control us, and as children of God, live confidently in the one who holds us. Today, we're starting with chapter 1, and you might think, well, that's the obvious place to start, but when we have only 5 Sundays to look at this book, wouldn't we want to stick with some of the more well-known stories and the interesting visions that are included in this book of Daniel? A quick glance at the story, and it seems a rather benign story when you consider the stories of the lion's den and the fiery furnace and the vision of 4 beasts. I mean, really, how powerful and meaningful is the story that reveals simply that Daniel refused to eat the food that was given to him. And yet the story, it sets the stage not only to show that Daniel and his friends have wisdom, but it shows that they were not going to forget who they were, from whence they came. Even though in the story the names changed, they were going to not be controlled by those who had power over them. The book begins with Daniel and his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah being taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. And the Babylonians had besieged Jerusalem, and they took over the king of Judah, and goods were plundered, and they took some people and made them captives and brought them to Babylon. And as the story unfolds, we get the sense that they had screened certain people and determined from outward appearances as well as intellect that they could serve the king well. They were to be trained by the Chaldeans, and the Chaldeans were not just the Babylonians, but they were a professional group within who were known for their wisdom and astrology. And so 3 years under their teaching, under their guidance, who knows how valuable they could be to the king in the coming years. And as the story begins, we read about how the king provided food for all those chosen captives. And not just any kind of food, but food that was fit for a king and all in the king's household. And so it seems like a wonderful gesture of hospitality and care for the well-being of these captives. And so why in the world would Daniel resist such a daily ration of food that represents the best one could possibly eat? Now, some will look at this and see that Daniel was a vegetarian and will model their eating after Daniel. And their Bible studies around Daniel's diet. Key that into a word search, Daniel's diet, and you'll see a number of plans about how to be a vegetarian or how healthy eating can be, and if you can tie that to a spiritual discipline or undertaking. And I'm not going to knock diet plans and how connecting what we eat to be a spiritual discipline and how that can be good for us, but there's more going on here. There's more going on here than Daniel simply that he didn't want to eat meat and he wanted to refrain from strong drink, and he was going to do what his mother said and eat your veggies. There's more than that. When meat and wine were served, such fare was often reserved for a feast and for joyous occasions. And Daniel and his friends may have thought there was not much to celebrate here. They had been removed from home. They had been removed from their home base of faith and held captive. How could they partake of such food when others were not going to be treated as well, or when there was nothing really to celebrate? To withhold from partaking of meat and wine could show that they chose to be in solidarity with those who did not have the fortune and were experiencing much harder times. I imagine that could be one of the reasons they limited what they were willing to eat, as well as uncertain as if this food had been used during sacrifices to pagan idols. See, when someone in their situation was given a daily ration of this kind of food, of meat and wine, over such a long period of time, it would come with strings attached. No king was just going to give the best to these captives because he was trying to be nice to them and was looking after their interest. To receive such food would mean that they were expected then to serve the king and serve with utmost loyalty in return. And so the food was served them to control them. I've given you the very best, and now you're obliged to give me the best. After all, look at how well I have treated you in these 3 years. And they chose to just eat the vegetables as an act of resistance. I did not tell you that the actually sermon title is Living Boldly, a Meal of Resistance. After the initial 10 days, we read they seemed better and fatter than all the young men who had eaten the royal rations. And after 3 years, their restricted diet worked. And this can reveal how God was with them, how it was God who was taking care of them. And the way the story unfolds, their good health is not the result of a vegetarian diet, but their faithfulness to God. And this is very well a story then of how they experienced Hesed. Hesed is one of the most beautiful Hebrew words that we have in the Old Testament. Hesed means steadfast love. It means compassion. It means mercy, forgiveness. Even in their circumstances, even when facing controlling factors, they've experienced and relied upon the steadfast love and care and mercy from God in their situation. You know, this prophetic book was written to people who were experiencing their own form of persecution, and they would have been inspired by the stories of courage from Daniel. The stories in the book of Daniel reveal that when people were experiencing their own persecution, their own suffering, their own uneasiness, when they were at the mercy or lack thereof of earthly kings ruling over them, they too could experience the steadfast love of God sustaining them. These stories in Daniel then are stories of hope. They're stories that encourage us to persevere. They're stories encouraging us to be bold and ever courageous. You know, sometimes this steadfast love of God can come, though, from unlikely sources. We think it has to come directly from God or from people of faith. Could such love possibly come from others outside of the faith? We read the heroic tales in the book of Daniel. We think Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are the heroes in the book. I'm guessing not many of us look at the story and see that the first hero in the book of Daniel is the palace master, Ashpenaz. And yet here, among this guy, he is one of the powerful elites. He's willing to take a risk, going against the king's command to do what? Make concessions for Daniel. And he knows that if they don't look as strong as others, the king finds out why. He is good as dead. And at first he's willing to allow for a 10-day grace period. Let's test this out and see how they're doing. And they look fit, well nourished as others, and so they were able to continue this grace period for 3 years. Here is a man who risked his life for Daniel, who could do so Daniel could live by his faith. In the story, Ashpenaz showed Hesed. He showed mercy to Daniel, as it is written, "Now God allowed Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master." It wasn't supposed to work that way. He was not supposed to be that compassionate. Today we might look at Ashpenaz as a model of those who have privilege and status and rank and position and influence, being willing to show others hesed, steadfast love, compassion, and mercy. He could have been a harsh taskmaster and made life even more difficult for Daniel when Daniel made the suggestion. But what do we read? Hear it again. Now God allowed Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master. When comparing ourselves to the world, we in America are a people of privilege and status. We live a very privileged life. And I don't care how people try to spin that we don't by saying, well, I haven't had it easy. You don't know my story. Even with such privileges in life, we can all still have setbacks and heartaches and sickness and experience hard times and loss. I'm not denying that reality, even as I speak of privileged position. The fact that you and I are here in a church on a Sunday morning suggests that we have some level of privilege. Some privilege and influence may come in the form of military rank, may come in the form of professional career, or good investments, educational level, family of origin, place of birth, religion, yes, even marital status, and dare I say, gender, skin color, or sexual orientation. We're not to use our privilege and our influence, our rank and our status and position, and lord it over others to try to control them or limit them. From our place of privilege or status in our greater community, we are to do what? To live as children of God, made in the image of God, to reflect the steadfast love from God that we've received in Jesus. It is actually just that simple, but oh so hard. As Christians, we are to embrace the way of Jesus where we love others in the way that Jesus is calling us to love. As we follow Jesus, we see many times how he was moved by compassion. We would hope that we have lots of stories where Jesus is moved by compassion. We read in Matthew as Jesus went about the cities and villages, when he saw the crowds of people, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus had gone up to the mountain to pray and get away from the crowds, and yet the crowds followed him, and he sees them, and he doesn't say, oh, you're on your own. No, he looked at them, the multitudes, and he and the disciples fed them miraculously. In Mark's gospel, we hear how Jesus was moved by pity. Someone on the outside, the leper, and cleansed him. In the Luke story of the Good Samaritan, an outsider, the Samaritan, not the priest or the Levite, was the one who helped. And the question is asked, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell at the hands of the robbers? And he said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. See, the book of Daniel would have been written differently had Ashpenaz not shown compassion in the form of resistance to his orders, to his commands. And his willingness to help Daniel enabled Daniel to eat a meal of resistance and not be indebted to the king or controlled by the king. Frederick Murphy, in his reflections on Daniel, this was written in 1996, he writes, a call to faithful resistance may require modern Christians to think through the whole new approaches to living our lives so that we no longer defile ourselves with the food and wine of kings and their militias and begin to work with those exiled people whom these kings and their militias intend to control. And then he asked the question, what is the food and wine that the modern emperors are offering us? What is the food and wine that the modern emperors are offering us? Last week, I mentioned the onslaught, and it really is an onslaught because it's ongoing. It's relentless. The advertisements that we see on any given day, convincing us so much to be unhappy until we buy in, until we get this. Advertisements that convince us what we must do and buy to make us happy. We need to resist what they're feeding us and go against the grain of our consumer-driven society and seek the abundant life that Jesus has claimed for us. Push back from the soundbite influencers and the entertainment media sources who have become the experts on everything from aviation to how to put out raging fires and bird flu and other health concerns. Push back from all of that and hold on to the hope that Christ gives in a season of change and of chaos. And we need to resist the fear mongers and the false teachings from people who misuse the gospel of Jesus Christ for personal gain and seek to live by the truths that Jesus actually taught. In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. It is just that simple. Friends, have you ever thought that what you are doing right now, that what you and I are doing, what we are doing right now is a form of resistance? Worshiping the Lord on a Sunday morning, do we ever see this as an actual act of resistance to the way that things are going on in the world? Resistance of the fear and hearing words of hope and steadfast love. Have you ever thought that the meal that we're getting ready to share is the meal of resistance, where we are formed and we are fashioned by what we eat and drink as the body and blood of Christ that shapes who we are? And we hear words. Listen closely to the liturgy, and we'll hear words of forgiveness and justice and hope and grace and Christ's love being poured out over us. Yes, what we're doing right now is a form of resistance. Look at us. Look at us. A bunch of ordinary radicals who are seeking to walk and live by the teachings of Jesus, to walk in that way that leads to life. May it be so. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.